Imagine waking up tomorrow, grabbing your coffee, and pulling up like your usual news feed.
Right, just doing your normal morning routine.
Exactly. Or even looking at the digital encyclopedia page for your own hometown,
Yeah.
and realizing that the fundamental history of your community has just been completely rewritten overnight.
Which is a wild thing to even picture.
It really is. And not by a conquering army, right? Not by a political rival taking over, but by an algorithm.
Literally just a string of code.
Yeah, in some server farm halfway across the world that basically decided your local reality just didn't generate enough engagement to be considered quote-unquote true.
I mean, it sounds like this dystopian science fiction concept.
Totally. It sounds like a movie.
But if you actually look at the underlying architecture of how we consume information today, this kind of silent erasure is already happening.
And that is exactly what we're getting into today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are stepping way, way back to examine exactly that infrastructure. We have this framing source we're looking at called Global Sensing, Perspectives of the Alien Anthropologist.
Such a great title, honestly.
It is. And the premise of this research is just fascinating. I want you, the listener, to imagine right now that you are not from here.
Right, like you're literally an alien.
Exactly. Imagine you are an objective alien anthropologist hovering in this little observation post in low Earth orbit.
Just looking down at the planet.
Right, looking down at our human, technological, social, and planetary systems without any of our daily baggage.
It is such a phenomenal analytical framework.
Yeah.
Because, when you remove the daily human bias.
The noise, basically.
Right, the noise. When you stop looking at the frantic 24-hour news cycle and start looking at Earth's data systems as an outside observer, you start to see these structural patterns.
Patterns that we are usually just way too close to recognize in our day-to-day lives.
Precisely. And this global sensing project, it operates by analyzing massive data sets in roughly 2-week cycles.
Okay, 2-week cycles.
Yeah, to detect these kind of macro shifts in human behavior.
And the mission of today's deep dive is to examine a very specific, honestly seismic shift observed in the latest data cycle. We are unpacking a phenomenon the source calls narrative sovereignty, the rise of micro-narrative revolutions.
Which I know sounds highly academic at first glance.
A little dense, yeah.
Bit dense, but I assure you it is the exact dynamic governing what you see on your phone right now.
Wow.
It dictates how your local community functions and honestly how information is going to be structured for the next century.
Okay, let's unpack this because we need to set the baseline before we look at the actual revolution part.
Absolutely.
The alien anthropologist observation begins by diagnosing the severe crisis in the global information ecosystem. We all know trust in centralized media is incredibly low.
Right, everyone feels that.
Yeah, but the source doesn't just say, people are mad at the news.
Yeah.
It points to a structural failure caused by algorithmic homogenization.
Yes, homogenization. That is the key word.
So break down that mechanism for me. How exactly are algorithms breaking our consensus reality?
Well, we really have to look at how machine learning models in social media and digital distribution actually function.
Okay.
These platforms are not designed to distribute accurate representations of the world.
Right. They aren't encyclopedias.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They're designed to optimize for time on device and engagement. And the most efficient way to generate engagement is through high arousal emotions.
Like getting angry.
Specifically outrage, yeah. Outrage and tribal validation. So over the last decade, these algorithms have actively filtered out nuance.
Because nuance is boring to an algorithm.
Because nuance and local context and complexity, they require cognitive effort. They literally slow down the scroll.
So it's a semantics flattening.
Yes, that's a perfect way to put it.
The system takes the messy, highly specific reality of a local event and just forces it through a compression algorithm.
Until it fits neatly into one of, 2 or 3 pre-approved, highly polarized global narratives.
It's kind of like a giant fluorescent lit beige shopping mall.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You know what I mean? It's built to maximize foot traffic and keep you moving past the stores, but it is completely devoid of any local flavor.
It's standardized. The system rewards standardization. And the fundamental question this source poses, which is really the core of our entire discussion today, is this. What happens to a society when the stories we use to understand ourselves no longer belong to us?
Right.
What happens when they belong to engagement optimization models?
I really want to pause on that. When the stories we tell no longer belong to us. because the source indicates that the human response to this algorithmic flattening isn't just apathy.
No, it's the opposite.
It's an aggressive reclamation project. Communities are pulling back, they are reclaiming their data, their history, their future through what the text calls the micro-narrative.
The street markets, to use your mall analogy.
Yes, exactly. The vibrant, messy, hyperlocal street markets. But I do want to challenge the source's definition here for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
It defines a micro-narrative as a hyperlocal, community-driven story that prioritizes lived experience over sweeping universal truths.
Right.
I struggle with that a little bit. Don't we actually need universal truths?
Well,
I mean, we need macro data to understand things like the climate or the national economy or public health.
Yeah.
Are they arguing that macro data is just inherently bad?
It is not that macro data is bad at all, but rather that macro data without local context is an illusion.
An illusion, how so?
So a universal truth in this context isn't like physics or mathematics. It's a top-down broadcast. Think of an economic indicator like the gross domestic product.
Okay, GDP.
Right. A global narrative might say the GDP is up, inflation is stabilizing, the economy is thriving. That is a quantitative average.
Which sounds great on the news.
It does. But an average, by mathematical definition, erases the outliers.
Oh, it completely flattens the curve.
Yes. So the macro narrative says the economy is great, but the micro narrative is the qualitative reality of a single neighborhood.
Ah, I see.
The micro narrative says, I don't care what the national GDP is. On this specific street, 3 family-owned businesses just closed, the local grocery store doubled its prices, and the lived experience here is severe economic contraction.
That makes so much sense.
The micro-narrative is the localized qualitative reality actively resisting that sanitized quantitative average.
That clarifies it immensely. The macro narrative is the spreadsheet, but the micro narrative is the actual territory.
Exactly.
And the source identifies 3 specific converging catalysts for why this shift is happening right now, like why this mass exodus away from the global spreadsheet is occurring today.
Yeah, there's a real perfect storm right now.
Let's dig into the first one. The sheer failure of global narratives to accurately reflect local realities.
If we look at the last 30 years of globalization, the dominant overarching story was one of inevitable convergence.
Like we're all just going to become one big global village.
Right. The premise was that as technology connected us, we would all slowly merge into this unified, frictionless society.
But that obviously hasn't happened.
Not at all. The local reality for billions of people has completely contradicted that broadcast. The global narrative promised connection, but the local reality often feels incredibly isolated.
Isolated and economically precarious, too.
Yeah, and culturally eroded, honestly. When the story you are continuously fed about the world is in direct conflict with what you observe out your own front window every single day, you don't just stop believing the story.
Well, you do.
You experience a systemic loss of trust in the institutions generating the story.
Oh, wow. Yeah, the trust just completely evaporates. Which leads directly into the second catalyst the source mentions, the democratization of storytelling infrastructure.
This is huge.
Because it's one thing to realize the global broadcast is broken, right?
Uh-huh.
It's another thing entirely to have the actual logistical capacity to broadcast your own alternative.
That is the critical pivot point. Historically, countering a mass media narrative required massive capital.
Like you needed a literal printing press.
You needed printing presses, broadcast towers, FCC licenses, fleet logistics to deliver newspapers.
It was reserved for billionaires and governments.
Exactly. But today, the entire production and distribution stack has been miniaturized and distributed.
I mean, we all have a broadcast tower in our pockets now.
We do. We are not just talking about smartphones with high-definition cameras, though. We are talking about decentralized cloud hosting, open source editing software, and global digital distribution pipelines that operate at near zero marginal cost.
So the barrier to entry for documenting, packaging, and globally distributing a localized lived experience has basically completely evaporated.
Anyone can set up the infrastructure today.
Anyone. But the third catalyst, the source points out, is more psychological, and I find this one fascinating. It describes a visceral, almost biological backlash against algorithmic homogenization.
Yes, the autoimmune response.
I want to spend some time here, because why does this feel so bad to us? Why do human beings instinctively recoil when the digital environment starts looking and sounding exactly the same?
It's a great question.
Like, you scroll through a video feed, and everyone is using the identical audio clip, mimicking the identical dance, utilizing the exact same facial filter, and deploying the same synthetic slang.
It feels eerie, doesn't it?
It feels profoundly unnatural. Why is that?
It feels unnatural because it runs counter to the fundamental mechanics of human evolution.
Okay, wrap my head around that. How does a TikTok dance relate to evolution?
Think about it like an ecosystem. Human societies, much like biological ecosystems, evolved in distinct, highly specific niches. Diversity, whether biological, linguistic, or cultural, is not merely an aesthetic preference.
It's not just about things looking pretty.
No, it is a vital evolutionary survival strategy.
Because monocultures are fragile.
Exactly. In agriculture, if you plant a massive uniform monoculture of a single genetically identical crop, it might yield high profits in the short term.
Right, it's super efficient for a minute.
But it is incredibly vulnerable. A single specific pathogen can wipe out the entire harvest overnight because the system lacks the genetic diversity to own out.
Oh, wow. And the exact same principle applies to culture and information.
It does. We possess an innate psychological drive to cultivate distinct identities because diversity of thought and perspective is how a society solves complex, unforeseen problems.
So algorithmic homogenization actually threatens our cognitive biodiversity.
That's precisely what the alien anthropologist is observing. The backlash is essentially an autoimmune response from human culture. The species is trying to protect its informational biodiversity from the monoculture of the feed.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. The micronarrative isn't just a cute trend. It's an autoimmune response to save the species.
It really is a survival mechanism.
And this brings us to a phenomenal case study in the source material that illustrates this exact survival mechanism in action. It looks at the revival of Maori storytelling in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
A really powerful example.
I know the basic history of colonization there, but how does this specific case connect to the mechanics of micronarratives we're discussing?
The Maori experience provides a perfect, high-resolution blueprint of this entire dynamic. For over a century, the dominant, globalized, colonial narrative operated as a relentless homogenizing force.
Trying to overwrite everything else.
Right. Through legal frameworks, educational policies, such as the historical banning of the Maori language, Te Reo Maori, in schools and centralized media, there was a concerted effort to overwrite the localized indigenous reality with a standardized imperial narrative.
It was the ultimate top-down universal truth attempting to erase the qualitative lived experience.
Oh, exactly.
But the source notes that the tide has dramatically turned recently. We aren't just looking at historical preservation here. We are looking at an active, living resurgence.
Precisely. And the mechanism of this resurgence relies heavily on what we are calling micro-narratives.
How so?
Well, it isn't just about translating global news into the Maori language. That would just be the same macro-narrative in a different font, so to speak.
Right.
It involves a profound recentering of knowledge structures, specifically through something called Wakapapa.
Okay, let me stop you there.
Right.
Break down Wakapapa for me, because my understanding is that it translates roughly to genealogy, but the source implies it operates as much more than just a family tree.
Oh, it is vastly more complex than a standard Western family tree.
Okay.
Wakapapa is essentially a highly localized, multidimensional oral mapping system.
An oral mapping system.
Right. It maps not only human lineage, but the relationships between humans, the specific ecology of their environment, the rivers, the mountains, and the spiritual history of a specific geographic coordinate.
That is incredible. So it's everything connected.
Yes. When a Maori storyteller shares a micro-narrative about a specific local river, it is not merely a folktale about water.
It's not just a myth.
No, it is a dense, encrypted data set concerning land rights, generational environmental stewardship, and a worldview that legally and culturally recognizes the river as a living ancestor rather than an exploitable natural resource.
Oh, wow. So when a community insists on using their specific micro-narrative to define their environment, they are inherently rejecting the jurisdiction of the macro-narrative.
They are claiming their reality.
Even the growing movement to use the name Aotearoa alongside or instead of New Zealand, like it's just a single word, but it contains an entirely different architectural understanding of the land.
It absolutely does.
It asserts that the land's history did not begin when a European cartographer drew a black line on a map.
Yes, and it demonstrates the immense leverage of local storytelling. By insisting on the micro-narrative, Indigenous communities are protecting massive, complex cultural legacies.
Which brings us to a massive shift in how we need to think about all of this. Because this isn't just about cute, feel-good local stories.
Not at all.
We aren't just talking about a neighborhood association having a fun little newsletter. We are talking about jurisdiction. We are talking about power.
Who gets to define what is real?
Exactly. Who gets to define what is real? The source moves from treating these stories as just cultural artifacts to framing them as a fundamental human right. It introduces the core concept of narrative sovereignty.
And narrative sovereignty is arguably the single most important paradigm shift identified in this entire 2-week sensing cycle.
It's a huge term. How does the text define it?
The source defines it as the inalienable right of a community to define, control, and distribute its own stories entirely free from external distortion, algorithm manipulation, or historical erasure.
So let's look at the mechanics of sovereignty for a second. In a geopolitical sense, sovereignty means you control your borders and your laws, right?
Right.
Narrative sovereignty means you control your context.
That's a great way to put it. Control your context.
But hasn't storytelling always been controlled by someone else? We talked about the printing press earlier. The historical reality is that if you control the printing press, you control the truth.
That is true, but that centralization was largely a function of technological limitation.
What do you mean?
In the 19th and 20th centuries, the capital required to lay telegraph cables, build broadcast towers, or run massive publishing syndicates meant that the power to distribute a narrative was inherently restricted to a tiny handful of massive monopolies or state actors.
You couldn't just start a global newspaper from your garage.
Exactly. The infrastructure demanded centralization, and that centralization mechanically required the erasure of local voices.
Because there's only so much space on the front page.
Right. If a hyper-local story contradicted the narrative of the empire or the financial interests of the media conglomerate, the gatekeepers simply refused to broadcast it.
They just spiked the story.
Narrative sovereignty is the explicit structural rejection of that gatekeeper dynamic. It is a community seizing the infrastructure and saying, our lived experience is no longer subject to your editorial approval or your algorithm's engagement metrics.
Here is where I see a really complex paradox in the source material regarding technology.
Oh, the technology paradox is fascinating.
Right. Because if we look at the last century, technology like broadcast, television syndication, early internet portals, and eventually the massive social media platforms we use today, that technology was the engine that enabled monopolies to broadcast over local voices.
Technology built the homogenization engine.
Yes. Yet now, the source argues that technology is the primary tool communities are using to secure their narrative sovereignty. It's like the poison is somehow the cure. Am I reading that correctly?
You are. It is a profound paradox.
Yeah.
But it resolves when you understand that technology itself is fundamentally agnostic.
Agnostic meaning it doesn't care what it's used for.
Exactly. It merely amplifies the intent of its architecture. The architecture of the early web and current social media is designed to centralize data and monetize attention.
Therefore, it amplifies homogenization.
But the current emerging generation of decentralized protocols, peer-to-peer networks, localized mesh networks, federated servers, that architecture is designed to distribute power at the edge of the network.
It amplifies the intent to reclaim identity and control.
You got it.
And the source gives us a concrete blueprint of this paradox in action. The Digital Indigenous Democracy Project.
A really stellar example.
Let's dig into the technical side of this because it sounds fascinating. How are they actually applying this decentralized architecture?
The Digital Indigenous Democracy Project is a brilliant synthesis of ancient oral tradition and cutting-edge decentralized infrastructure.
Yep.
It is an initiative that utilizes secure digital tools, distributed databases, encrypted communications, multimedia archiving to preserve and share traditional consensus-building practices and ecological knowledge.
But how does that ensure sovereignty?
The critical element is the network topology itself. They are not simply recording a sacred elder story and uploading it to a centralized platform like YouTube.
Right, because if you upload it to a massive corporate platform, you instantly surrender sovereignty.
The minute you hit upload.
The platform can run advertisements over it, the algorithm can bury it if it doesn't get enough immediate clicks, or the corporation can simply delete it if their terms of service change.
Exactly. Sovereignty requires infrastructure control.
You have to own the pipes.
In these digital indigenous projects, the community often controls the physical servers or utilizes decentralized web protocols where no single corporate entity holds the master keys.
Oh, wow.
They control access permissions. They explicitly dictate the context in which the digital artifact is engaged with.
So it's not just out there for anyone to remix or distort.
Right. They are using modern cryptography and distributed networking to build an impenetrable, self-governed vault for their cultural memory, ensuring that the knowledge transfer to the next generation remains completely unmediated by a tech executive in Silicon Valley.
That is an incredible use of infrastructure. It really is. But it also introduces a massive point of friction that the source highlights.
The legal friction.
Yeah. We are using the word sovereignty, which is inherently a legal and political concept. The text discusses the emerging need for legal frameworks and policy protections that actively recognize narrative sovereignty. But how do you actually legislate a story?
Yeah.
How do policymakers write a law that balances a local community's right to control its narrative with the broader societal need for open historical analysis and a cohesive global dialogue?
It seems impossible, doesn't it?
It really does. It seems like a massive headache.
It is the primary intellectual battleground of this movement right now. Western legal systems are, by their architectural nature, universalizing forces.
Meaning they want one rule for everybody.
Exactly. A law attempts to apply a standardized, uniform rule across an entire population. But micronarratives are inherently fluid, highly contextual, and deeply resistant to universal standardization.
Right. Let's play this out with a hypothetical.
Okay, let's do it.
If a local community claims legal narrative sovereignty over the history of a specific regional conflict or event, like they say, this is our official story of what happened during the flood.
Right.
But the national government's historians say, no, our archival data suggests this event happened differently. Who wins in a court of law?
That is the exact friction point.
If you legally enforce a community's exclusive right to its narrative, do you inadvertently criminalize outside historical research or journalistic critique?
It's a huge danger. If a community possesses a statutory right to a story, it creates a boundary that outsiders might not be allowed to cross without permission.
Which fundamentally breaks how journalism works.
Policy frameworks struggle immensely here because intellectual property, law like copyright or trademarks, was designed to protect commercial products and individual creators for a limited time.
To make sure Disney gets paid for Mickey Mouse.
Exactly. It was not designed to protect collective, multi-generational, continuously evolving oral histories.
It feels like the moment you successfully lock a dynamic, living micronarrative into a rigid legal framework, you kill it.
You strip away its fluidity.
Yeah, it stops being a fluid reflection of lived experience and just becomes another rigid state-sanctioned truth. You've just traded a corporate algorithm for a bureaucratic mandate.
Which is precisely why the alien anthropologist observes that the most effective manifestations of narrative sovereignty are not occurring in courtrooms or policy think tanks.
They aren't waiting for the laws to catch up.
No, they are happening on the ground, through direct action and alternative media creation.
Which perfectly sets up the next major observation from the source. Let's move away from the high-level theory and look at the actual street-level mechanics.
Let's do it.
What does this revolution actually look like in practice, day to day?
The data shows an absolute explosion in hyper-local, community-funded media operations.
Like what kind of operations?
We are seeing a massive proliferation of neighborhood-specific podcasts, localized Substacks, community-owned server instances, and highly targeted video channels that completely ignore national or global talking points.
They just don't care what's trending globally.
Exactly. The example from the text that I absolutely loved is a podcast called The Localists.
Yes, I loved this example.
The premise is brilliant in its limitation. It is a highly produced investigative project that tells the complex, untold stories of a single city block.
Which one specific block?
One point.
And my initial reaction reading that was, how many episodes can you possibly get out of a single block? Like, wouldn't you run out of material in a week?
I mean, that reaction challenges our algorithmically trained attention spans. We have been conditioned to believe that scope equals importance.
Right.
That if a story doesn't affect millions of people, it isn't worth our time.
But if you actually stop and analyze a single block, think about the sheer density of data.
Oh, it's staggering.
If you trace the property deed of one specific corner bodega back 100 years, you uncover the zoning laws that shaped who was allowed to live there, the migration patterns of the 3 different immigrant communities that operated that store.
The acoustic signature of the street traffic over decades.
Yeah. The hyper-local economic impacts of a bus stop moving 50 feet to the left. A single city block contains a staggering, fiercely complex ecosystem of human triumph, failure, and adaptation.
What a project like The Localist achieves functionally is a deceleration of time.
Deceleration, I like that.
The dominant feed trains us to accelerate, to consume global tragedy, celebrity gossip, and political outrage in rapid-fire, half-second intervals.
Just swipe, swipe, swipe.
Exactly. Hyperlocal media demands sustained cognitive attention. It asserts that the profound drama of human existence, the actual mechanics of society, are functioning right here in your immediate physical environment.
You do not need to parse a global trending topic to find profound sociological meaning.
You really don't.
If you, the listener, are hearing this on your commute right now or walking your dog, I want you to literally look around your immediate neighborhood. Think about the last 3 local news stories you heard.
Were they actually local?
Right. Were they actually local micro-narratives, or were they national political talking points that a syndicated broadcasting company just repackaged with a local anchor's face?
Usually it's the latter.
True hyperlocal media forces you to look at the actual territory, not the map. And it's not just about consuming media differently. It's about altering the historical record itself.
The archival aspect of this is huge.
The source highlights the rise of grassroots archives, specifically pointing to a global initiative called the People's Archive. Break down the mechanics of a grassroots archive versus a traditional one for me.
Traditional state or institutional archives are inherently top-down. They collect the documents of the powerful, the treaties, the macroeconomic data, the correspondence of leaders.
Generals and the presidents?
Exactly. The People's Archive, however, operates as a decentralized ledger of daily existence. It is an active resistance against the quiet erasure of normal lives.
So what are they collecting?
It systematically collects photographs, audio diaries, grocery receipts, handwritten recipes, and mundane letters from everyday citizens.
Wow, grocery receipts. That is so granular.
Yes. So if a traditional historical textbook tells you the dates a specific war started and ended, and the names of the generals...
The macro narrative.
Right. The Grassroots Archive tells you the exact mechanism of survival. It tells you how communities engineered workarounds when the supply chains failed.
How they actually lived through it.
It provides the audio recordings of the specific songs people sang in the shelters. A textbook is a macro summary synthesized by the victor. A grassroots archive is raw, uncompressed data provided directly by the survivors.
And from a sociological perspective, when an individual realizes that their mundane, everyday struggle is being meticulously preserved as historical data, it fundamentally alters their psychology.
It does. It gives them agency.
It generates a profound sense of civic agency. They realize their specific micro-narrative has structural value.
And when people realize they have value, they assert themselves in physical space.
Which leads to the third street-level tactic the source observes. Art as an infrastructural intervention. Specifically, street art in murals.
Street art functions as an incredibly efficient micro-narrative deployment system.
Especially for marginalized communities, right?
Absolutely. Because it bypasses all institutional gatekeepers. You do not need a gallery curator to approve your aesthetic, and you do not need an algorithm to distribute it.
You just need spray paint and a wall.
Right. By painting a massive mural depicting a hyper-local hero or a specific community struggle directly onto the physical architecture of the neighborhood, artists are forcibly altering the environment.
It's an unscrollable medium.
Unscrollable, I love that.
You can't swipe past a 3-story mural on your way to the subway. It interrupts the sanitized corporate advertising landscape with a localized truth.
You are forced to engage with it.
But, okay, I need to heavily play devil's advocate here.
Please do.
Because I am reading all these examples in the source, the block level podcasts, the hyperlocal archives, the neighborhood murals, and it sounds incredibly empowering.
It does.
It sounds like the perfect antidote to algorithmic homogenization. But let me aggressively challenge this. If the fundamental problem with global narratives is that they are too broad and disconnected, isn't the ultimate danger of micro-narratives that they are dangerously narrow?
You are identifying the primary structural vulnerability of the entire movement.
Right. If everyone completely abandons the macro-narratives, if we all retreat into our own hyper-local, cryptographically secured lived experiences, aren't we just accelerating the collapse of consensus reality?
The fragmentation problem.
We are essentially building thousands of smaller, fiercely isolated echo chambers. How do we avoid creating hermetically sealed narrative silos in a world that is already violently fragmented?
It's a terrifying thought.
Because I don't see how a podcast about a single city block helps us coordinate a global response to a pandemic, or international supply chain failures, or climate change.
Your critique is entirely valid, and it aligns perfectly with what the alien anthropologist dataset defines as the echo chamber paradox.
The echo chamber paradox.
Yes. The source explicitly acknowledges that if narrative sovereignty simply morphs into narrative isolationism, we lose the baseline capacity for coordinated human action.
We can't solve global problems.
If we possess no shared facts, no overlapping reality whatsoever, we devolve into thousands of decentralized tribes, each utterly convinced of its own absolute localized truth and completely incapable of interfacing with the tribe across the river.
So how do we solve the paradox? We know we cannot return to the era of top-down algorithmic homogenization. That system is actively toxic.
We can't go back to the fluorescent mall.
No. But total fragmentation is paralyzing. So how do you bridge the divide without compromising the sovereignty of the local nodes?
The source outlines a two-pronged mechanism to solve this, one technological and one cognitive.
Okay, let's start with the tech. Let's examine the technological infrastructure first.
The system requires protocols that facilitate cross-pollination without demanding centralization.
Like federated networks.
Exactly. The primary example given is the rapid adoption of federated networks, utilizing protocols like ActivityPub. Mastodon is probably the most recognizable implementation of this right now.
Break down federation for me. I know people talk about Mastodon as an alternative to centralized platforms like X or Facebook, but how does the actual plumbing work?
It's completely different plumbing.
Because if it's just another app on my phone, how is it actually any different?
The difference is entirely in the architecture. A traditional social media platform is a walled garden. There is one massive central database controlled by one corporation, running one universal algorithm, enforcing one set of terms of service for billions of users.
Right.
Federation completely dismantles that architecture. Think of it less like a social media app and more like the global postal service protocol.
Okay, the postal service. Walk me through the analogy.
In the postal system, you have your local post office. It has its own local postmaster, its own specific hours of operation, its own local culture. But because every post office in the world agrees on a basic underlying protocol, the standard shape of an envelope, the concept of a stamp, the formatting of an address, your local post office can route a physical letter to a completely different independent post office in Tokyo or Berlin.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Mastodon works the same way. Anyone can set up an independent server, an instance, for their specific neighborhood or their specific profession.
And that server is totally sovereign.
That server represents total narrative sovereignty. It has its own rules, its own moderation, its own data storage.
But because it runs on the ActivityPub protocol.
Exactly. It can still communicate with the rest of the world.
So if I am on a sovereign, localized server in Chicago, and I want to follow the micro-narrative being published by a sovereign server in rural India, I can do that.
You can do so seamlessly, provided both communities consent to the connection. It allows independent, sovereign communities to exchange information on their own terms, peer-to-peer, rather than forcing all their data through a centralized corporate filter.
That makes perfect sense. The decentralized architecture of the technology actually mirrors the sociological concept of narrative sovereignty.
It's the physical manifestation of it.
But here's the problem. Technology alone is never the complete solution.
Never.
You can build the most beautifully decentralized federated network in the world, but if the humans using it are still deeply tribal, defensive, and hostile to outside information.
Right, the human element.
Your federated network just becomes a highly efficient protocol for hurling insults at the neighboring server.
Which brings us to the second and significantly more difficult prong of the solution.
The cognitive prong.
Yes. The source argues that upgrading our network protocols is absolutely useless unless we simultaneously upgrade our cognitive protocols. It introduces the concept of narrative literacy.
Narrative literacy. Sounds like a course they should mandate in middle school.
It really should be. We need a fundamental evolution in how humans process conflicting information.
But what does that actually require a person to do in practice?
The core mechanism of narrative literacy is the development of narrative empathy.
Empathy.
And this is not about feeling sorry for someone. It is a cognitive skill.
Okay.
It is the ability to encounter a micro-narrative from a community that fundamentally contradicts your own lived experience, and instead of immediately triggering your psychological defense mechanism,
Instead of just getting defensive and fact-checking.
exactly. Instead of fact-checking it against your own reality and declaring it false, you possess the cognitive capacity to understand it as a valid operational data point in their reality.
I see the angle, but that is incredibly difficult.
It's the hardest part of all this.
You are essentially asking human beings who are biologically wired to reject anomalous data that threatens their worldview, to hold two conflicting truths in their head simultaneously.
It requires a massive cognitive load. You have to be able to say, the reality of my micro-narrative is completely valid and functional here in my context, and the reality of your micro-narrative is completely valid and functional in your context, and neither of us has to be mathematically wrong for the other to be right.
Wow. It's moving away from a binary true or false algorithmic mindset into an ecological understanding of truth.
Yes, ecological truth.
Like if you look at a cactus and a fern, they require entirely different environmental conditions to survive.
Right.
The cactus isn't wrong for thriving in a drought, and the fern isn't false for needing humidity. They just belong to different ecological micro-narratives.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Teaching that exact type of ecological thinking, that cognitive flexibility, is the only way a society can successfully bridge the federated echo chambers without destroying the sovereignty of the local nodes.
You have to understand the environment that produced the narrative.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the horizon line of this deep dive. The alien anthropologist's research looks out into the near future.
What comes next?
Right. If communities are currently using federated networks and podcasts to reclaim their sovereignty, what are the next generation tools they will deploy?
The source points to two specific technologies here.
And these are technologies that are currently surrounded by massive hype, but the text applies them in highly specific functional ways: artificial intelligence and blockchain.
Two buzzwords, but used very intentionally.
Let's start with AI, because my immediate reaction is that AI is the ultimate existential threat to micronarratives.
Many people feel that way.
I mean, large language models are literally trained by scraping the entire internet and synthesizing it into average, highly predictable outputs. It is a homogenization engine on steroids. How on earth can AI protect local stories?
Well, if community relies entirely on a centralized, foundational AI model controlled by a megacorporation to generate its content, you are correct. It will result in catastrophic semantic collapse.
The micronarrative will be instantly sterilized.
It would just sound like a corporate press release. However, the source outlines how communities will use localized, fine-tuned AI models as defensive infrastructure, specifically as translation and distribution engines.
Okay, break that down. How does a fine-tuned translation model work differently?
Imagine a highly specific micro-narrative recorded in a marginalized dialect, utilizing deep local idioms, complex historical references, and specific slang.
Right, something very context-heavy.
If you run that through a standard translation algorithm, it strips all the context and returns a literal, lifeless translation.
It misses the joke, essentially.
Completely. But a localized AI model, trained entirely on the specific cultural corpus of that community, can act as an infinitely scalable, context-aware babblefish.
A babblefish, nice.
It doesn't generate the story. It translates the human-generated story into 50 different languages while mathematically mapping and preserving the emotional and historical weight of the original idioms.
So it preserves the cryptographic key of the culture. It allows the incredibly specific story of that single city block to be perfectly understood by a community on the other side of the planet without the local storyteller having to alter their voice, sanitize their slang, or flatten their perspective to appease a global platform.
AI lowers the friction of cross-cultural communication while preserving the structural integrity of the micronarrative.
That is wild.
Yeah.
It scales the distribution without diluting the sovereignty.
Which is the holy grail. And that leads to the second technological pillar of the future: blockchain.
Okay, let's heavily translate blockchain for a second, because outside of cryptocurrency speculation, most people don't understand the mechanism.
And we really need to strip away the financial aspect here.
Right. Let's look at the cryptography. What does a distributed ledger have to do with community storytelling?
At its foundational architectural core, A blockchain is simply an immutable, decentralized database.
A very secure filing cabinet.
It is a record-keeping protocol where data is processed through a cryptographic hash function and verified by a decentralized network of nodes.
Meaning everyone has a copy of the key.
Exactly. Once that data is written and mathematically verified, it becomes permanently computationally impossible to alter, edit, censor, or delete without the consensus of the entire network.
Ah, I see the mechanism. If we apply that cryptographic immutability to history, it acts as digital amber.
Digital amber, that captures the functionality perfectly.
It's like the mosquito trapped in fossilized tree resin in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
The DNA is perfectly statically preserved.
Yes.
Communities can use blockchain protocols to take their grassroots archives, the audio diaries, the unedited video files, the localized data, and lock them into an immutable ledger.
They are securing their history.
So if, say, 50 years from now, a hostile political regime takes power, or a new tech monopoly tries to update its database to erase a specific community's history, they literally mathematically cannot do it.
They cannot delete the file. The local reality is cryptographically locked in the amber.
It represents the ultimate infrastructural defense against historical revisionism.
It mathematically guarantees that the uncompressed, qualitative reality of the marginalized survives permanently. No centralized authority can alter the hash.
That is profound. It gives permanent structural weight to the ephemeral street market we were talking about.
It builds a permanent foundation.
And this combination AI for frictionless, context-preserved distribution and blockchain for mathematically immutable preservation, this sets the stage for what the source calls a new global dialogue.
A dialogue that functions as a network of peers rather than a top-down broadcast.
We are moving toward a system where millions of verified, sovereign micronarratives interface with each other.
And to facilitate this highly complex network, the alien anthropologist introduces a critical human element. The narrative ambassador.
The narrative ambassador, the human protocol in the network. Who are they?
They are individuals within these communities who possess exceptional levels of the narrative literacy we analyzed earlier.
The ones with high cognitive empathy.
Right. They are deeply rooted in their own sovereign micronarrative, but they possess the cognitive flexibility and the technological fluency to translate that experience across the federated network.
So they aren't politicians.
No, they do not operate as politicians speaking for a community. They operate as network engineers, weaving connections and identifying overlapping realities between disparate communities.
They are routing the packets of human understanding. They are the ones building the pluralistic tapestry, ensuring the individual threads don't snap.
Beautifully said.
Which brings us out of the theoretical data and right back to you, the listener.
Yes, back to the individual.
Because a macro shift like the rise of micronarratives, this total restructuring of how truth is formed, doesn't just happen on a server rack. It happens in the daily cognitive choices of individuals. So, what is the listener's functional role in this new infrastructure?
The source outlines highly actionable steps for this. It begins with auditing your own media consumption.
Auditing your diet, basically.
Right. You must practice listening deeply. That means intentionally bypassing the algorithmic feed to seek out micro-narratives that originate entirely outside your demographic or geographic comfort zone.
You have to actively build your own cognitive narrative empathy.
Exactly. And when you find those stories, when you encounter a valid micro-narrative from a marginalized voice in your own city, your job is infrastructural amplification.
Meaning what, practically?
Meaning, do not summarize their experience in your own words to farm engagement on your own profile. Provide the direct link. Share their unedited voice.
Use whatever network leverage you possess to route traffic directly to their sovereign node.
Exactly. I want to read a specific observation directly from the conclusion of the global sensing text because it synthesizes the entire mechanism we've unpacked today.
Go for it.
Quote, "The micronarrative revolution is not a retreat into isolated tribalism. It is the necessary infrastructural work of reclaiming the raw threads of our shared humanity, one verifiable sovereign story at a time." End quote.
The call to action is so clear. Pay attention to the infrastructure of your reality. What story will you mathematically preserve? What localized truth will you amplify?
It's all up to us.
Because the future of human consensus is no longer going to be generated by centralized machine learning models. It is going to be decentralized, and it is going to be woven by us.
And as we close this analysis, I want to leave you with one final structural paradox to ponder.
Oh, I love a good paradox at the end. Let's hear it.
We have spent this deep dive analyzing how marginalized communities can use tools like cryptographic hashing as digital amber to permanently defend their histories.
Right.
But if we successfully mathematically lock in our current present-day understanding of the world into an immutable ledger, are we inadvertently trapping future generations in our reality?
Oh, wow.
Will the perfectly preserved, unalterable lived experiences that we fight so aggressively to validate today eventually calcify into the exact kind of rigid, unyielding, universal truths that our own descendants will have to rebel against just so they can claim their own narrative sovereignty?
That is wild. The decentralized revolution inevitably becomes the centralized establishment.
It is the ultimate cycle.
I absolutely love that twist. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of truth. Keep questioning the map, keep listening to the local territory, and we will see you next time.